In the mid-1800s, a failed apprentice doctor and religious studies student that was more interested in taxidermy, riding horses, shooting guns, and beetle collecting proposed a scientific theory that shocked and conflicted with the ideas of theists, common European citizenry, and even Pope Pius IX. This concept, known as the theory of evolution, propelled Charles Darwin into a fame that ultimately influenced society worldwide and long after his death in 1882.
Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in the Mount Shrewsbury, United Kingdom. He was the fifth child out of a family containing a total of 6 children. Darwin's father was a medical doctor, and his grandfather was a celebrated botanist. In 1831, he had taken a surveying voyage around the world, but then contracted a tropical illness that made him nearly handicapped for the rest of his life. In 1839, he had married his cousin Emma Wedgwood and had 10 children, and then later died April 19, 1882, in Down, United Kingdom.
When growing up, Darwin's father wanted him to be a medical doctor and start a family tradition, but blood made Charles queasy. Charles was more interested in nature and grew up a very wealthy child with lots of privileges who loved to explore and find out new things in nature. Being curious, Charles wanted to go out and explore the world, so he became a naturalist, geologist, and a biologist, which led him to his findings and gave him the information to formulate the theories that made him famous.
Starting in 1831, Charles Darwin set off on a 5-year survey voyage on the HMS Beagle, a 235-ton brig designed in 1807 in the Cherokee class. During this voyage, Charles Darwin had little ambitions of scientific findings or any groundbreaking research. Once they had finished surveying the coast of South America, they had set sail to the Galapagos Islands and stopped there. The Galapagos Islands are comprised of 13 major islands and 7 minor ones, all having unique creatures to the Galapagos, but varied slightly from island to island in order to perfectly adapt to their environment.
Darwin had noticed this and wondered about the origin of all these creatures. One very famous discovery Charles Darwin made were the finches of the Galapagos, which started the basis of the theory. He had found that the finches had made adaptations to their environment with different shaped bills, what they eat, and their size. He also, with the help of other scientists, had found that tortoises were adapting and that you could tell by the shape of the tortoise's shell which island they had come from. These tortoises are one of the strongest examples of evolution ever in the Galapagos.
This idea of adaptation was a complete contradiction to the common belief that all species were static. After decades of thinking and making sense of his findings, he had come to the conclusion that evolution was true and that species were not a creation of God, nor was there a God.
Charles Darwin first formulated the theory of evolution somewhere around 1839, about 20 years after he published his book called Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Darwin only published his theory after another scientist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace also proposed a very similar theory, which prompted Darwin to publicly announce that his research had also led him to the same conclusion.
Alfred Russel Wallace was also a strong contributor to this theory. Alfred gathered information and collected specimens during an 8-year expedition to what was the Dutch East Indies at the time and is now Indonesia, home to a very large variety of diverse plant and animal life. By 1855, he'd explored Sulawesi, where he found the bird called the maleo. He had noticed that they had evolved to their environment, so much so that they don't use their body heat to warm their eggs. They actually use the island's geothermal energy by digging into the ground to where it is just the right temperature. This led him to conclude that living creatures do evolve, but he was not sure how or why.
Then, 3 years later, on the island of Halmahera, he realized, while sick with a fever that was caused by malaria, that animals evolved to adapt to their environment, as well as the idea of survival of the fittest, which he later wrote about in an 8 to 9 page paper to Charles Darwin for a peer review, in which he stated, "Why do some die and some live? The answer is survival of the fittest. Because of diseases, the healthy will thrive. Because of predators, the strongest, fastest, and smartest will thrive. And with these actions occurring, the race will be improved overall, because their inferior creatures will die, leaving the superior creatures remaining."
They then also agreed to jointly publish their writings on the subject of natural selection. Though as Darwin had predicted, they faced immediate backlash because their ideas went against the singular main religion of Britain, which was the belief in creationism. Many of the main religious leaders denounced the idea of natural selection, calling it things like a brutal philosophy.
The original book contained some of Darwin's earlier notes and an essay written by Alfred Russel Wallace, even though it was published by Darwin. The fact that it became an immediate bestseller was because it made claims that were incredibly different to the current belief. The controversy spread mainly because of the fact that the book suggested that humans did not have a God-given place in the world, and even worse, that man had evolved from a lesser, more primitive animal.
One of the main things that Charles Darwin had studied was natural selection. There are multiple different types of natural selection, one example being sexual selection, meaning the more attractive the creature, the more likely it is to find a mate and spread its genes, thus spreading the original creature's traits to its offspring. Stabilizing selection is when natural selection favors the creatures in the intermediate stages rather than the creatures in the juvenile or mature stages.
Another form is directional selection. This is when natural selection favors one extreme or continuous variation so that the better extreme will outlast the worst extreme. Yet another form is diversifying selection. This is when natural selection favors both extremes so that the intermediate stages are less common or possibly lost. And finally, kin selection. Kin selection is when natural selection favors a trait that is altruistic to family members. Darwin also studied two main types of evolution, macroevolution and microevolution, both of which are discussed in the theory of evolution. Microevolution is when species change in small ways, like the color of the creature or the size of that creature. Macroevolution is a form of evolution that can create new species over a long period of time and with a large amount of changes. All these findings also led to the conclusion that species were not static. This conclusion created much conflict between scientists and theists.
Charles Darwin proposed the ideas and theories that were in complete opposition to the religious beliefs of theists. His actions sparked multiple debates about what was believed to be Earth's true history and what were the origins of humankind. After multiple debates circulating around with renowned scientists and religious scholars, the idea of evolution as a possible event rather than an impossible one was not so far-fetched as people originally thought it would be.
Though no direct attack on Darwin's theory were made by either Pope Pius IX or Pope Leo XIII, they had made references to the theory in defense of the overwhelming questions they had been faced with afterwards. During Pope Pius IX's papacy from 1846 to 1878, he spoke with the First Vatican Council on the matter, and they concluded that faithful Christians are forbidden to defend conclusions of science, especially if condemned by the Church, and that faith and reason are never at odds with each other.
After Pope Pius IX's papacy, Pope Leo XIII succeeded him from 1878 to 1903. Pope Leo XIII was much more open to the ideas of science and this theory, but he faced much opposition from the Vatican and leading church circles. He stated that he disliked the thirst for novelty and unrestrained freedom of thought, of scientific theory, but also believes that the Bible is not always correct, and that both theologians and scientists must confine themselves to their own disciplines. This acquiescence for the theory by Pope Leo XIII was a real step forward for Darwinians compared to Pope Pius IX's refusal of conformity to this idea.
The people affected, or groups of people affected by Darwin's theories and claims, were the members of the Catholic Church and theists that believed that God had created all heaven and earth and everything pertaining to it. The theory that stated there being no God, as well as there being an evolutionary chain, conflicted with theists' views of God's absolute creation. But later, many new ideas of both evolution and theism were compromised to fit each and every person's view on the origin of humans and how they see fit.